Dracula, aka Dracula, a Love Tale, directed by Luc Besson, of course the director of movies like The Fifth Element and Leon, two movies that I absolutely adore. And this one stars Christoph Waltz, Caleb Landry Jones as Dracula, and Zoe Bleu. Now this is tonally very similar to the Francis Ford Coppola version of Dracula that came out some years ago now. I guess that was a fair time, so here we have a romanticised version of Dracula for the new generation. Is this movie a horror? It is certainly horror adjacent, but I would say it is more a Gothic romance that is rooted in blood, is the best way I would describe this. So I am sure everyone is more or less familiar with the story of Dracula, but I'll give you a synopsis. And the movie actually starts off in the 15th century where we see Vlad Dracul as the Prince of Wallachia, and he asks one thing of God. He will defend his kingdom and fight the Muslims, the Turkish Ottoman, I believe, probably, with the proviso that God will keep his love safe. However, she ends up getting killed shortly after this, so Vlad, now angry at God for, as he sees it, a betrayal, curses the name of God and denounces him, and therefore is now turned into a kind of a living vampire, cursed never to die and wander the earth in this undead state. But Vlad has other plans. He intends to find his long lost love, believing she will be reincarnated at some point, and creates various other vampires to go out and look for her, inevitably crossing paths with Mina Murray, whose fiance Jonathan Harker happens to be a lawyer sent to negotiate a property issue with Dracula, and this leads him to Mina, and of course the love story continues. What will happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So, is this a horror movie or is it a romance movie? Like I say, it is a romance movie dripping in blood. If you are wanting a violent, horrific vampire movie, then you are better looking at movies like 30 Days of Night. If you are wanting more of this kind of immortal love story, this is the movie for you. Kind of like the Francis Ford Coppola version. Now, you might ask, why make this movie? Because it is tonally very, very similar to the Francis Ford Coppola movie, but you know, I would arguably say younger movie goers don't really watch older films like that anymore, so maybe this is why this film was created. Let's talk about the positives. Now, like the Coppola version, this is a very lavish production. The biggest compliment I would say of this movie is just the level of production design here. This movie, we see Dracula spanning the 400 years where this story takes place over different kind of like countries and things. So we have all sorts of wonderfully realised sets, location shooting, costumes, makeup, with different kind of like depictions of Gothic history and things like this, and it is very, very lavish. So I think those of you who are keen for this kind of this Gothic romance through history would certainly enjoy the very, very lovely production design that this movie presents to us, and it is really nice. It's a very, very lavish production, and the movie does lean very heavily into the romance side of things, really forsaking other elements of the story in favour of this romance. And I do feel that they get this kind of connection and this idea here of love reborn through reincarnation. You know, you do genuinely feel that sort of sense of that connection, because that's all he really cares about as a character, Dracula. He's not out wanting to necessarily kill victims for any other reason than he wants just to find his love. That's just a kind of a byproduct of his position. So I do think the romance angle here is very much at the forefront. I do think it has a palpable feeling of that sort of connection. So those of you who have a romantic heart, I feel will maybe enjoy this one. Because yeah, it definitely succeeds on that level, and it has this kind of, like I say, this dramatic sort of overtone to it. I think the performances are fine from the main players here of the cast, and there are a couple of exceptions for smaller roles, I would say, which I'll kind of come on to a little bit. But everyone here through the major roles, I think, does a good job, and you know, it's this kind of hyper-realised version of kind of history. Everything's a little bit more insinuated and things like that, and but there's some kind of fun, sometimes over-the-top performances that I think sometimes will work, sometimes maybe less so, but you know, when it's trying to be big and grand, I think it does succeed in that respect. The Dracula character here seems very powerful. It's maybe a little bit too similar to the Gary Oldman version, certainly having this kind of old decrepitated version in the kind of the castle that, you know, with the kind of the very elaborate hairpiece and things, thinking, well, did you need to do that so close to the kind of the Gary Oldman version? But, you know, we're on the positive still. I still think it's, as I say, the hair and makeup and stuff is very good. And, you know, it does follow the Dracula story fairly closely. It adds a few new things. One element that I kind of quite enjoyed with this one is how he is able to seduce people. Since he has lived at this point for 400 years, he has effectively made like the ultimate aphrodisiac perfume, and he actually uses this externally made product that he has created through gathering the flowers through his travels all over the world to create the ultimate perfume, which he uses to seduce people, rather than it kind of be exactly a supernatural or purely a supernatural kind of thrall type situation. I actually kind of quite like that, because it kind of gives you the idea that Dracula has been all over the world and kind of like has perfected this kind of this art of seduction ultimately. So that was very, very good. On a technical level, the cinematography here, I mean, Luc Besson is a true pro, and he has this kind of signature European sort of style, and again, in a Gothic tale like this, I think it's effective and it looks great. The kind of the horror elements, as I say, they're not at the forefront here, but we do get a little bit of kind of more overt horror sprinkled through the movie, you know, and some of it I think is effective. You know, they've changed some of the elements here. As I say, they never really kind of mentioned Van Helsing. Lucy has changed to Maria. Instead of London, the kind of the latest sort of period to take place in France. So there's some kind of tweaks and sort of changes here that I think, you know, purists might kind of be a little bit frustrated with, but I think some of it is absolutely fine. And, you know, it follows the more or less kind of story that you've kind of seen before, so it doesn't deviate too much, which leads me to what doesn't work. I mean, why make it? I mean, because it is so similar. Again, especially similar to the kind of the Francis Ford Coppola version. You would think, why do this? I mean, obviously the Dracula is in the public domain, so there is that kind of recognisable brand name, I suppose, where you don't have to pay royalties. So I can understand it from a business perspective, but making it so tonally similar to that version, you know, they had an opportunity to maybe create something a little different, but there are elements here that seem so similar. You have to kind of like wonder why some of the decisions were made. I wish it had a little bit more focus on his life pre-becoming a vampire, because we do get a fairly good sort of setup here in the kind of the 15th century, seeing Vlad as a human leader. And obviously this is based on the real life Vlad Tepes. And again, I feel if you look at the pantheon of Dracula stories, including the Francis Ford Coppola one, they have elements of it, but very, very rarely is it ever the forefront. And I think that would have been the way to go in a way, to have more of a kind of a focus on that sort of side of the story, which the historical Dracula is an interesting story all on itself. And those elements will remind you of like you know, the kind of full plate armour from Excalibur mixed with obviously the kind of the Gothic horror. I would have liked to see a little bit more extended sequence on that, to be honest, and maybe less of the kind of the retreading of the what we've already seen, the you know, the Jonathan Harker scenes at Castle Dracula and things like this and all that. So, you know, it was a little bit of a missed opportunity, I personally think. Other elements where I feel there are some maybe missed opportunities. There's some humour here that is injected that I don't know quite fit. It's not that much, but there are a couple of kind of elements, sort of jokey elements through the movie where I don't know, it didn't quite work for me. It felt a little bit too modern. There are some odd choices in some of the kind of the acting from the smaller roles here, and there are even some sort of sequences. There's two sequences that have this kind of interpretive dance moment that will look really weird. And those kind of dancers slash actors are really over-egging it. Let me just say that. I thought those sequences came across as particularly trite. Again, maybe this is a point of difference for the movie in its defence. You know, it has these sequences where Dracula is using this perfume and everyone's kind of like dancing in tandem and or just kind of doing this weird sort of like hypnotic dance. But yeah, it looks a little sillier to me, I have to say. I wasn't a huge fan of that, but at least they tried something new. There is these, so Dracula in his castle, rather than kind of the brides of Dracula, he has these gargoyles, and they're created via CGI, and this is his army, really. But they kind of look like Disney creatures, is the best way I would describe it. The way they kind of are made with the CGI, and they're running around the castle, it reminds you of, like, you know, Cinderella or something, with the kind of the animals and all this. They're a little bit of an odd choice, and yeah, they're very clearly CGI, and they sort of stick out, I've got to say. And again, they're played to be more cartoony than scary. If you want to have these, I personally would have thought they would have been more effective had they led into a bit more of a spookier, horrific kind of look. Instead, they're kind of like relatively cute, and I don't know if that particularly worked. There's some inconsistencies with maybe the vampire lore here. For example, the daylight, that seems to affect vampires differently in different situations. Not exactly, you know, clear what the rules are in regards to sunlight particularly, and crosses with this one, because sometimes they seem effective, sometimes they do not, but there's no real kind of reason why. At the film's climax, we have this assault on Dracula's castle, and the Romanian army is there, and it's like, well, you know, well, how did we get the Romanian army? There's one like line that Christoph Waltz's character says, I know someone that could help us, and then there's the Romanian army there. So, well, that seems like quite a large step. And then the final kind of climax, how Dracula, his story comes to an end, let's just say. It seems a little bit too easy. Again, they've gone for a slightly different route between Christopher Waltz's character, we'll call him Van Helsing, and the Dracula character. They try to go for a different route, and I understand what they tried to do, but it's a little bit anticlimactic and a little bit too easy, and you would have just thought, hasn't Dracula thought about this? That's all I'll say. When you watch the movie, you'll understand, but hasn't he thought about this himself? He's been alive, or semi-alive, for 400 years. Has he not considered this himself, given that amount of time? But, you know, there you go. So there it is. It's a little bit of a mixed bag, to be honest with you, but I would say the overall lavish production, the somewhat kind of over-egged performances make it a sort of somewhat theatre-style movie is the best way I would describe it. As in, it seems like actors are slightly kind of playing like hyper-realised versions of the characters, a bit larger than life. But I kind of think it works for the most part. And again, if you haven't seen the Francis Ford Coppola version and you want to watch a lavish, gothic, over-romanticised version, I do think it sells that romantic connection very well, then this movie does succeed. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. I think I'd be curious to hear other people's opinions on this. Please let me know what your thoughts are of it if you've seen it, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.